They don't want you to know how close PC gaming's biggest empire came to absolute zero. For decades, Valve has printed infinite money. But behind the memes and the massive summer sales lies a dark history. $1 billion illegal gambling scandal, heavy government lawsuits, and a humiliating hardware disaster that almost burned Valve to the ground. Yet somehow, gamers still worship this man as a hero. How did Gaben survive the feds and engineer the greatest hardware comeback in history? Let's get into it. Before the massive esports arenas, the Steam sales, and the infamous Harvard dropout story, Gabe Newell was just a kid delivering newspapers and telegrams for Western Union in California, and his original goal, becoming a doctor. But he had a quiet, intense obsession with coding, tinkering with early programming languages in his spare time. That obsession carried him all the way to Harvard University in 1980, where he started studying computer science, but he wouldn't stay there for long. The turning point happened in 1983 during a totally routine Thanksgiving trip. Gabe went to visit his older brother Dan, who had recently taken a job at a small software company in Washington called Microsoft. His first real encounter with Steve Ballmer wasn't a formal meeting. Ballmer just snapped at him, telling the college kid that if he was going to loiter in the office, he needed to make himself useful. That aggressive nudge was all it took. Gabe took a quarter off from Harvard, accepted a job as Microsoft's 271st employee, and never went back to finish his degree. For the next 13 years, he became a foundational pillar of the company's meteoric rise. Gabe served as the core producer for the very first three versions of the Windows operating system, Windows 1.0, 2.0, and 2.1, helping steer the launch of the software that would eventually dominate the entire globe. He became a self-made millionaire, surfing the Microsoft explosion. But the ultimate reality check came from a tiny 12-person team of rogue developers in Texas called ID Software. They released Doom, and by 1995, Microsoft realized something humiliating. A violent game with chainsaws and pixelated demons was installed on more computers worldwide than their brand new operating system. For Microsoft, it was an embarrassment, but for Gabe, it was an absolute win. He realized that gamers were the real power users. But at the time, everyone believed that Windows was structurally incapable of running games compared to MS-DOS. He personally reached out to ID Software's John Carmack and offered to port Doom to Windows 95 entirely for free, leading the engineering team that built the WinDoom port to prove that Microsoft's operating system could be a legitimate gaming platform. Porting Doom proved to Gabe that the PC wasn't just a boring spreadsheet machine. It was the ultimate gaming platform. He realized he didn't want to spend his life optimizing software for someone else's company. He wanted to build the games that drove the hardware. In 1996, on his literal wedding day, Gabe Newell cashed out his Microsoft millions, handed in his resignation, and walked out the door to start Valve. Gabe and Mike Harrington cashed out, took their millions, and founded Valve in 1996. They didn't just want to make a generic mindless shooter, they licensed the Quake engine and aggressively mutated it into their own in-house engine called Gold 6. Just months before the scheduled release, Gabe looked at the project, realized it was boring, and made a ruthless decision. He delayed the launch for a full year, burning through his own personal bank account to scrap almost everything and rebuild it from scratch. The massive financial gamble paid off because the final version was a complete anomaly. There were no lazy cutscenes and no breaking immersion. You were Gordon Freeman fighting through Black Mesa. But Valve did something even more massive to secure their legacy. They gave the community the keys to the kitchen. By releasing their SDK, they essentially handed players the exact same tools they used to build Half-Life. In 1999, two college kids, Min Lei and Jess Cliff, used that SDK to build a game mod called Counter-Strike. They had zero budget and built the 3D weapon models just by looking at photos in military magazines. The mod blew up so fast that this community project started pulling more concurrent players than actual AAA games backed by massive corporate publishers. Instead of sending lawyers to shut it down with a cease and desist letter, Valve made an absolute power move. They hired the modders, bought the IP, and turned it into the biggest competitive shooter on the planet. But Counter-Strike's explosive success created a massive structural nightmare for Valve. The year was 2002. High-speed internet barely existed, and the majority of gamers were still suffering through agonizingly slow 56K dial-up modems. Every Counter-Strike update broke the player base in half. Without the exact same patch as your friends, multiplayer was impossible. Valve relied on a third-party network called One, but it was getting crushed by Counter-Strike's insane player counts. Servers melted down, and cheaters completely overran the lobbies. Gabe realized the old way of gaming was dead. They needed a unified background client client that would update games automatically so players never had to think about it. But Steam wasn't just supposed to be an updater. Gabe envisioned a completely centralized ecosystem. It would have a built-in server browser, a proprietary anti-cheat system, and a way to buy games digitally from Valve. So Gabe did what he always does. He built it himself. The launch of Steam wasn't a triumph. When version 1.0 dropped, it was a catastrophic, unplayable disaster that almost ruined their reputation entirely. Players who just wanted to play Counter-Strike were locked out of their own accounts for days. The UI was this ugly, olive-green mess that hogged RAM, crashed constantly, and throttled internet speeds. Gamers absolutely hated Steam, but Gabe was already thinking 10 steps ahead. In 2004, Valve dropped Half-Life 2. It wasn't just a sequel, it was a generational masterpiece. The physics engine was mind-bending. The gravity gun completely changed how players interacted with virtual environments, and everyone on Earth wanted to play it. To play the physical disc you bought at a retail store, you were forced to install Steam. Millions of gamers suddenly had Steam permanently installed on their PCs. They had no choice. Once those millions were locked in, Gabe set his sights on his next target, the physical retail mafia such as GameStop and Walmart. Developers had to spend millions manufacturing physical discs, printing plastic cases, and shipping boxes across the globe. By the time the publisher and the distributor retailer all took their massive cuts, the actual creators were left fighting for absolute scraps. But later in the video you will know Steam wasn't always pro-consumer. In 2005, Valve officially opened the floodgates, letting outside developers sell games on Steam, starting with a weird little indie brawler called Ragdoll Kung Fu. The first massive lever they pulled was the legendary Steam sale. By slashing game prices by 80 or 90%, they completely rewired gamer psychology. People stopped buying games just to play them. They started hoarding massive digital backlogs, turning Gaben into a viral internet deity who magically emptied your wallet every single summer. In 2007, they dropped Team Fortress 2. At first, it was just a highly polished class-based shooter. Then Valve used it to pioneer a psychological trap that would permanently alter the gaming industry. Games as a service. They introduced digital loot crates, keys, and an insanely addictive microtransaction economy based entirely on trading cosmetics. They didn't stop there. Then came Dota 2 in 2013. Valve didn't just make a MOBA. They weaponized competitive gaming and basically invented the modern esports craze. They introduced the Compendium, which was essentially like sports betting. Millions of players were directly crowdfunding the tournament prize pools, pushing the international to astronomical multi-million-dollar payouts that made traditional sports broadcasts look completely outdated. By combining the infinite money glitch of the TF2 and Dota 2 economies with a storefront that extracted a massive 30% tax on every single third-party game sold, Valve's power became unimaginable. They didn't even need to make their own games anymore. They were the undisputed toll booth for all of PC gaming. But there was one piece missing from their modern empire. In August 2012, Valve released Counter-Strike Global Offensive. Here's the wild part. At launch, CSGO was kind of a massive L. It started as a side project just to port Counter-Strike, source to consoles. PC players hated it, and player numbers were rapidly dropping. Valve needed a lifeline. So in August 2013, they dropped the Arms Deal update, ripping the loot crate system straight out of TF2 and dropping it into a hyper-realistic military shooter. They didn't just add colors, they engineered a ruthless digital scarcity machine. They introduced randomized wear levels from battle scarred to factory new, and extremely rare drops like knives that had a fraction of a percent chance of unboxing. Suddenly, your weapon wasn't just a gun. It was a highly rare speculative digital asset. YouTubers and streamers completely lost their minds. Case unboxing videos became an instant viral goldmine, with creators screaming into their mics over pulling a $500 karambit. And the genius part? Valve controlled the entire ecosystem, taking a fat tax on every single skin bought or sold on the Steam community market. But there was a hard limit. Steam money was trapped in Steam. You couldn't legally cash out your digital inventory for real-world money. So the internet did what the internet does. They built a loophole. Because Valve left their API open, massive third-party websites started letting players link their Steam accounts and use their inventories like literal casino chips. Suddenly, teenagers were gambling thousands of dollars on roulette wheels and coin flips using digital weapon skins. The scandal went insanely viral. The Washington State Gambling Commission stepped in. Class action lawsuits were filed by angry parents. Gabe and Valve were suddenly in the crosshairs of federal regulators. While Valve was fighting the feds in the US, international regulators kicked the door in. By this point, Steam had a massive consumer rights problem. Because they had opened the floodgates to indie developers, the store was suddenly packed with broken, buggy, early access asset flips. If you bought a literally unplayable game, getting your money back was basically impossible. Then, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission stepped up and sued Valve into oblivion. Valve lawyers actually tried to argue in court that they didn't legally do business in Australia. They just provided softwares. The judges laughed at them. Australia slapped Valve with a massive multi-million-dollar fine and forced them to put a giant consumer rights warning right on the front page of the Steam store. The European Union started circling right after, threatening massive antitrust and geo-blocking fines of their own. Valve was forced into a corner by heavy international legal pressure. In 2015, they finally implemented the infamous 14-day and 2-hour refund policy. It was a massive W for gamers. But behind closed doors, it was the first time Valve actually bent. With the software side burning down and regulators watching their every move, Gabe looked for an escape hatch. He looked at Windows 8, called it a catastrophe, and decided Valve needed to build its own operating system. Enter the 2015 Steam machines. It was supposed to be a revolution. Valve relied on third-party manufacturers to build the boxes, and they shipped with the very first iteration of SteamOS, a purely Linux-based operating system. Here was the fatal flaw. They had no translation layer for Windows games. If a developer didn't natively port their game to Linux, you simply couldn't play it. The hardware was overpriced, the experimental controller was weird, and the game's library was empty. The Steam machines completely flatlined. Valve wasn't the heroic developer anymore. They looked completely out of touch. Most companies would have panicked and tapped out. Valve went completely silent. First, they sent out cease and desist nukes to shut down the gambling bots. Then, they started quietly pushing out Source 2, an entirely new, heavily modernized game engine to future-proof their ecosystem. They tested it on Dota 2, eventually used it to build the VR masterpiece Half-Life Alyx, and laid the groundwork to completely overhaul CS:GO into Counter-Strike 2. But Gabe hadn't forgotten the humiliating failure of the 2015 Steam machines. To finally beat Microsoft, they built a piece of literal software magic called Proton. Proton was a compatibility layer that allowed Windows games to run natively on Linux perfectly without developers having to change a single line of code. They fixed the fatal flaw of the first SteamOS. The trap was set. Everything Valve learned from the failures of the past decade, the controller prototypes, the Steam machine disaster, the UI overhauls, culminated in one final masterstroke: the Steam Deck. When it launched, it completely shattered the market. It shipped with a perfected version of SteamOS, powered by Proton, tapping directly into the massive game libraries. It bypassed Windows entirely. Gabe Newell didn't just survive the lawsuits, the hardware failures, and the gambling PR nightmares. He used them as stepping stones to completely redefine how we play PC games. The king never left the throne. He was just building a better one. If you want more deep dives into the gaming industry's biggest secrets, hit subscribe and drop a like. The algorithm loves to bury these stories, so sharing this video helps the channel massively. See you in the next video.